What is the secret of mana? Well, saddle up your Flammie, because we're about to learn all that and more. This is the story of Seiken Densetsu 2, or Secret of Mana as Western fans know it. My name's Zio, and I'll be your lore keeper. Our tale begins in 1987. Boy, we sure keep going back to that year a lot. A seminal year in gaming and pop culture that would give rise to several beloved gaming franchises. A struggling Japanese game studio by the name of Square began work on a game with the title Seiken Densetsu, which translates to Legend of the Holy Sword, subtitled The Emergence of Excalibur. This was the brainchild of a young designer named Koichi Ishii, who had joined Square in 1986. The Emergence of Excalibur centered around an unnamed hero who set out to find the sacred sword Excalibur to defeat the evil Vargas and liberate the island of Vardos. The story was to be told across multiple generations and would have been among the first RPGs to use such a concept. This was an ambitious project planned for release on the Famicom disk system, spanning a whopping 5 discs. Square was even bold enough to start advertising and taking pre-orders for this game. However, the scope of this project was far too great for what the company could reasonably handle. The high cost of rent in Tokyo's Ginza district, coupled with their string of commercial failures on the Famicom disk system, put them in dire straits financially. Emergence of Excalibur was cancelled by the higher-ups during the early planning stages. Square had to issue an apology letter along with a refund to everyone who pre-ordered. The letter also encouraged them to pre-order another upcoming title, a little thing called Final Fantasy. Mr. Ishii was put on the Final Fantasy team, where he would be responsible for the recurring elemental crystal motif. He was also the creator of the iconic Chocobos and Moogles. Fast forward to 1991. By this time, the RPG market in Japan was white hot and showed no signs of cooling down. Square was in much better shape financially and thus able to work on multiple high-end projects. Final Fantasy III was already out the door, with work on the 4th installment well underway. A project for the Game Boy called Geminites was also in the works. Geminites was reworked into a Final Fantasy spin-off dubbed Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, with Koichi Ishii serving as director. This was a pet project of Ishii, who wanted to create a game with the intriguing story of a Final Fantasy title with gameplay similar to The Legend of Zelda. Seiken Densetsu was released in June of 1991 in Japan, and in North America later that year as Final Fantasy Adventure. European fans would get it the following year under the name Mystic Quest. The game that we would come to know began life as something very different and given the code name of Maru Island, a collaboration with renowned Dragon Ball artist Akira Toriyama. The development team for this project was dubbed Maru Tori. Maru Island was planned as a launch title for the Super NES CD add-on, a joint partnership between Nintendo and Sony. This relationship began in the late 80s as a secret project of a Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi. While Sony was on the cutting edge of technology throughout the 70s and 80s, they had no interest in video games at the time, seeing them as a mere fad despite their popularity. Kutaragi made a deal with Nintendo to create the SPC 700 sound chip for their upcoming 16-bit hardware behind his boss's backs. Once the top brass caught wind of the project, they were apoplectic. If not for the intervention of then CEO Norio Oga, Kutaragi would have no doubt been handed his walking papers. Once again, with Oga's blessing, Kutaragi and Nintendo would get to work on 2 separate CD-ROM devices. One was an add-on that attached to existing hardware, and the other was a Sony-branded console that played either SNES CD games or conventional Super NES cartridges, the precursor to what we would come to know as the PlayStation. The CD-ROM deal went sideways though, as Nintendo felt it gave Sony too much control over software licensing. This didn't sit well with Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nintendo went behind Sony's back to negotiate a more favorable deal with Philips, who was one of Sony's main competitors at the time. In the spring of 1991, Sony announced their Super NES compatible PlayStation, but Nintendo would announce their backdoor deal with Philips the very next day. Nintendo and Sony would try to mend fences over the next year, producing several hundred prototypes. Both companies would ultimately part ways. In the wake of this, even Sega would attempt to court Sony to work on a new console, but Sony would go their own way and go on to create the PlayStation that we all know and love. As a result, this put the Marutori team in a rather difficult position. Realizing there was no way that everything they had planned would fit on a Super NES cartridge, some deep cuts had to be made. Roughly 40% of the content that was planned for the game had to be cut or changed in some way. There were initially plans for multiple endings and even a spaceship. The unused elements were later incorporated into a future project, Chrono Trigger. Everything else was heavily reworked into the second entry in the Seiken Densetsu franchise, but this time without the Final Fantasy name behind it. This is the point where the Mana series would come into its own. Koichi Ishii was in the director's chair, with fellow Final Fantasy vet Hiromichi Tanaka serving as writer and producer. The programming was done by Iranian-American Nasir Gabelli, who had also worked on several other Square titles, including Rad Racer. Secret of Mana was Gabelli's final project with Square, before retiring in his mid-30s off the royalties from the Final Fantasy series. The music was composed by Hiroki Kikuta, who joined Square in 1991 after initially being rejected by Nihon Falcom. His first task at Square, believe it or not, was playtesting Final Fantasy IV. Kikuta wanted the music to match the visual style of the game. He also drew his inspiration from vacations he took to Germany, Fiji, Hawaii, and the United Kingdom. Kikuta wanted to create an auditory experience, unlike anything players had heard before. The opening theme, Fear of the Heavens, immediately sets the tone for the adventure that awaits the player. To achieve this, Kikuta would often spend 24-hour days in his office. Kikuta also created all the sound samples himself, a task that was often given to sound engineers. The art was done by Shinichi Kameoka and the late Hiro Isono, among others. Kameoka designed two of the main playable characters, while Isono designed the iconic artwork of the three main characters standing before the giant tree in the title screen. Secret of Mana would introduce several new gameplay elements that would become staples in the Mana franchise, as well as other games. By the early 90s, the formula for Japanese RPGs had become firmly established. They were mostly colorful trips through high fantasy worlds filled with fantastical fiends slain by generic heroes using swords and sorcery in traditional turn-based fashion. Sure, there were a few outliers like Phantasy Star, but developers seldom deviated from one or more of these elements. Unlike other RPGs where combat and exploration took place on separate screens, battles took place in real time. This was done to give battles a much more visceral feel than any turn-based system could offer. According to Hiromichi Tanaka, this idea was initially considered for Final Fantasy IV, but they felt it was too radical of a change from the established formula. Final Fantasy would go on to be known for reinventing itself, but not this early in its life. It was perfect for Secret of Mana though. Unlike other menu-driven RPGs, Secret of Mana made use of an innovative ring command system which let players swap weapons, use items, and cast spells on the fly. The game still had RPG staples such as experience points and leveling up. There were 8 types of weapons, some of which could be used to navigate certain areas. Weapons could be upgraded by using orbs obtained from bosses. Each weapon had their own special moves that became available as characters gained proficiency with them. After an upgrade, these moves were done by holding down the attack button for a certain time as a meter filled up, then releasing it once the meter reached the desired level. Harder hitting attacks took longer to charge. Magic also became stronger over time as characters used it. Up to 3 players could play the game at once. The multiplayer function wasn't in the design document, but the developers thought it would be a nice touch. The world is blessed with the power of mana, allowing civilization to flourish under its boon. Humanity began exploiting mana to create the ultimate weapon, the Mana Fortress. But this blasphemy angered the gods, who sent divine beasts to destroy the fortress. This led to a bloody conflict that nearly exhausted all traces of mana in the world. Before all was lost, a hero wielding the legendary mana sword destroyed the fortress. Humanity would slowly rebuild in peace after that, but time flows like a river, and history repeats. Our adventure begins with an orphan named Randy and his two friends exploring a waterfall outside their hometown of Potos Village. The area is off limits to the townspeople, but the allure of treasure is too strong for this trio. Randy slips and falls to the bottom while the other two run back home. He sees a rusty sword in a stone and a voice tells him to remove it. This has the unintended consequence of causing monsters to appear. Randy meets a warrior named Gemma, who immediately recognizes the rusty blade as the legendary mana sword, but isn't sure how Randy managed to pull it out. He tells Randy that he may be able to re-energize the blade by visiting the 8 mana temples. He also tells him to visit the sage Luca at the water temple. Randy is exiled from his home by the elder in response to pressure from the other villagers. Randy heads to the water temple where he meets the 200-year-old sage Luca, who tells him about the sword and the mana fortress. Along the way, he meets a girl named Prim who leaves her home in protest to an arranged marriage to a local nobleman. Her true love is a soldier named Diluc who was deployed to the witch Eleni's castle in the haunted woods. He also meets the sprite child Popoi, who had been living with the dwarves and lost their memory. During their travels, they also befriend the elemental spirits who endow Popoi and Prim with their magic. Popoi specializes in offensive magic, while Prim makes use of healing and support spells. The trio gets around the world by being shot out of a cannon and later a white dragon named Flammie. The Vandal Empire is also after the mana seeds. An ancient sorcerer named Thanatos is pulling their strings, hoping to use the mana fortress to create a new, peaceful world. Thanatos' body is deteriorating, so he needs a new one. Prim's boyfriend Diluc is the perfect candidate. Thanatos and the Empire succeed in breaking all 8 seals and reviving the mana fortress. This means a giant creature called the Mana Beast will come forth to destroy the fortress. Since the beast can't control its rage, it could very well destroy the rest of the world. It's up to Randy and friends to save the world by dealing with Thanatos and using the Mana Sword to put down the rampaging Mana Beast.
RPG 革命聖剣伝説2ファイナルファンタジーのスクエアから。
After a tumultuous development process, Seiken Densetsu 2 hit store shelves in Japan on Friday, August 6, 1993 for 9,800 yen. The game was planned for an April release that year but was pushed back to August. Japanese gaming magazines gave it generous coverage in the months leading up to its release. These publications previewed some of the basic info about the game, including its mechanics. Early screenshots even showed elements that wouldn't make it into the final product. Famitsu magazine gave the game a respectable cross score of 33 out of 40. The reviewers praised the game for its graphics, music, and storytelling. Square even published 2 guidebooks. The first was a knowledge compendium with information about weapons and enemies. The second was a complete strategy guide released the following month. In Japan, it was one of the best-selling home video games of 1993, just behind Street Fighter II Turbo, selling over 1 million units. The Western market was a stark contrast from its Japanese counterparts. Sure, RPGs had their fan base in the West, but they wouldn't rise to mainstream popularity until the late 90s. Western gamers generally favored action titles, which sold more units than RPGs at the time. They didn't contain nearly as much dialogue and were thus easier and cheaper to localize. RPGs of that era went for upwards of $70 US, which is worth about $150 US as of 2023. For that reason, they were seen as a huge gamble, and many localization projects would be cancelled before release or just skipped over altogether. To further illustrate this, Square released a total of 19 Super Famicom titles between 1991 and 1996, the majority of which were RPGs. Only 6 of these were brought overseas. I'm not including Breath of Fire here, as that was made by Capcom, who would go on to localize subsequent entries in that franchise in-house. Many of these titles were translated by fans, but wouldn't see an official release outside Japan until many years later. For example, the sequel to this game was released in 1995, but wouldn't see an official localization until 2019 as Trials of Mana. But it wouldn't be long before Secret of Mana made its way outside Japan. The game was first shown to fans in the West as Final Fantasy Adventure II and slated for a fall release, just in time for the 1993 holiday season. The action-based combat system drew many comparisons to The Legend of Zelda, and gaming publications of the time were quick to latch on to this. Work on the English translation began sometime before the initial Japanese launch. This is where Ted Woolsey comes in. This was the man responsible for marketing and localization at Square during the first half of the 1990s. Woolsey joined Square in 1991 after finishing his master's degree in Japanese literature. A typical project would have him traveling to Japan with his family, where he'd have around 30 days to finish a project, often with disjointed screen text windows. This made keeping track of story beats rather frustrating. The dialogue boxes in the English version made use of a fixed-width font, which meant that dialogue had to be shrunk down to the bare minimum. Japanese writing is much more compact than English. For example, a sentence written in Japanese would only take a handful of characters. Translating that same sentence into coherent English required far more letters, including spaces.
They were almost always kind of rush jobs. Secret of Mana they were writing the screen text as I was translating in Tokyo. I was flown over for a month or so with my family, and we hung out at a kind of a cool little condo just outside of Shinjuku, and I'd go into work every day. It was frustrating because stuff I translated the day before would be changed, and I had to go in and find it and tweak it, and then there were edits made by people that were also on the remake staff, some of which that weren't up to my standards at the time, and so that particular project I think ended up being much more of a mishmash than I had hoped.
On Sunday, October 3rd, 1993, Secret of Mana hit store shelves in North America. Secret of Mana went on to become the second top-selling Super NES title in October of 1993, just below Mortal Kombat. By 1996, Secret of Mana went on to sell over 500,000 units in the US alone. Gaming publications of the day such as GameFan and Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it glowing praise for its sound and visuals. They also gave it high marks for its gameplay and storytelling. Nintendo Power gave the game generous coverage in November of that year. They gave it solid marks for its sound, visuals, and gameplay, but criticized the tedium of charging up attacks. They even mentioned a spaceship as well as multiple routes through the game, neither of which would appear in the final game. A few months later, they would revisit the game in a feature called The Days of Mana. It was a 3-part walkthrough that took readers through the events of the game, written as if it were experienced by the 3 heroes themselves. Secret of Mana would appear on Nintendo Power's top 20 list for a solid 14 months. European fans would also get their hands on the game near the tail end of 1994. Game releases in Europe were often upwards of a year behind their Japanese and North American counterparts, or in some cases skipped over altogether. Going into the 21st century, it seemed that Square could do no wrong. They finally had their breakthrough in the Western market with Final Fantasy VII and subsequently Final Fantasy VIII. Additionally, 3 new Final Fantasy titles were slated for release between 2000 and 2002. Square had also set its sights on the silver screen. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within was released in July of 2001 to a very mixed reception. The Spirits Within flopped at the box office, grossing only $85 million of its $137 million budget. Shortly after that, several key figures at Square, including Hironobu Sakaguchi, would step down from their positions. Longtime rival Enix was looking to merge with Square to help defray development costs. but the failures of the spirits within prompted them to pump the brakes on the deal. But the merger would go full steam ahead after the successes of Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, with the deal being finalized in 2003. Square was also in the process of patching things up with Nintendo in light of Microsoft joining the console war in 2001, and this renewed relationship continues to this day. In 2003, Square Enix released Sword of Mana, which was an enhanced remake of the first game for the Game Boy Advance. Sword of Mana was co-developed by Square Enix and Brownie Brown, which was founded by Square alumni Shinichi Kameoka and Koji Tsuda. In Japan, this version was called Shinyaku Seiken Densetsu, which translates to New Testament, Legend of the Holy Sword. Secret of Mana was supposed to receive this treatment as well, but this never materialized. All we have are these pre-release assets that were shared by Mr. Kameoka himself. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Square Enix began releasing enhanced ports of older titles on iOS and Android devices. The first 3 Seiken Densetsu titles were brought to the Nintendo Switch as part of the Seiken Densetsu collection in 2017. The collection was brought to the West in 2019 as the Collection of Mana, featuring Secret of Mana alongside Final Fantasy Adventure and the long-awaited third installment dubbed Trials of Mana. In 2018, the game was given the full 3D remake treatment, complete with a new art style, revised cutscenes, and voice acting. This was made available on the PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and PC in February of that year. The remake received mixed reviews, drawing criticism for its visuals and voice acting.
Peaceful land, paradise is threatened by an unspeakable evil, and only one person has found the power to restore perfect order. In a new action-adventure game for your Super NES comes an exciting tale, The Secret of Mana, from Square, maker of the world's greatest video games.
So, what exactly is the Secret of Mana? It's never explicitly stated, but there are some very plausible theories. Perhaps the secret could be that the game had to be essentially cut in half to accommodate for the constraints placed on the developers by the switch to a cartridge. Or this secret could be a clever marketing tactic to gin up curiosity and get people to buy the game to find out. Or it could be the relationship between Randy and the Mana Tree itself. Speaking of Randy, the official names of the 3 main heroes weren't codified outside Japan until recent years. The player was allowed to name them whatever they wanted. Randy was just called the hero or the boy. Popoi was known simply as the sprite, and Prim was just the girl. The Japanese and Western versions of the game have similar yet different title screens. The logo and the opening text are immediately noticeable, but it doesn't stop there. The Western version of the background image is zoomed in with a focus on the trio in front of a fuzzy mana tree. The Japanese version has the image zoomed out, but the image of the tree is much cleaner. While it may not have been intentional, the Japanese title screen places more emphasis on the splendor of the tree itself, whereas its Western counterpart seems to put more focus on the trio of heroes. Believe it or not, the title track was composed after the images and title sequence were created to match the timing. The slow reveal of the mana tree was due to the image having to be compressed to fit onto the cartridge. The logo and opening text crawl were there to stall for time while the game did the decoding in the background. Those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s no doubt remember that Nintendo of America had very strict censorship guidelines. Bad language was a no-no. Religious and sexual imagery were also on the chopping block. But despite these efforts, there were some things that somehow managed to slip through the cracks. Secret of Mana is also one of these cases. There are 2 floating book-type enemies in the game with a dirty little secret. If you bleed out their MP, they'll briefly open up to a naked centerfold. Wait, a naked lady in my Nintendo game? How'd that get there? Maybe that's the real Secret of Mana. As I was writing this, there were many times where I couldn't help but think of how different things might have been had certain events not unfolded as they did, not just for the game itself, but for the entire industry. What if Nintendo and Sony went back to the negotiation table to hammer out a more favorable deal for both sides? Then perhaps the schism between Square and Nintendo may have never happened. What if Final Fantasy IV adapted the action-based combat system? What would Maru Island have looked like under the Chrono Trigger name? While this prospect sounds exciting, let's not forget that CD-based games in that day were hit or miss in terms of quality. While Square may have been masters of their craft at the time, they weren't exempt from having to learn the ins and outs of new technology. It's fun to speculate what might have been and how the gaming landscape may have taken a very different path over the past 30 years. Secret of Mana serves as a testament to the creativity and resiliency of the human mind. Changes in specifications mid-development are unfortunately commonplace. But when you're on a team at Square, or any company, and your boss says, "Make the product," the only answer is yes, sir. The show must go on, so you adapt, improvise, and overcome. Then you go on to make the best damn action RPG you can. From the ashes of that original concept rose two of the most beloved RPGs of the 16-bit era. While Maru Island as Chrono Trigger may very well have been a fantastic game, we would have been robbed of another beloved franchise. Sometimes the greatest tragedies lead to the greatest triumphs. So if you made it all the way here, comment with your favorite Secret of Mana memories. As always, thanks for watching. And remember, to thine own self be true. Until next time, farewell.